Hello chess lovers, welcome to an exciting commentary of a thrilling game from the fifth round of the 45th Chess Olympiad between Montenegro and Germany. The stakes are high as the other three games ended in draws, making this match the decider for which country will emerge victorious. Let's dive into the game between Kadric from Montenegro and Keymer from Germany. The game begins with White advancing the king's pawn to e4, a classic move aiming for central control. Black responds by moving the pawn to e5, mirroring White's move and establishing a symmetrical position. White develops the knight to f3, attacking the pawn on e5 and preparing for rapid development. Black counters by moving the knight to c6, defending the pawn and also aiming for central control. White continues with the bishop to c4, targeting the weak f7 square and setting up for the Italian game. Black develops the knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn and preparing to castle. White plays the pawn to d3, solidifying the center and preparing to develop the other bishop. Black responds with the bishop to c5, aiming at the vulnerable f2 square and maintaining pressure in the center. White advances the pawn to c3, preparing to support the center and possibly expand with d4. Black plays the pawn to a6, preventing any potential knight or bishop moves to b5. White castles kingside, securing the king and connecting the rooks. Black responds by moving the pawn to d6, reinforcing the center and preparing to develop the light-squared bishop. White develops the knight to d2, aiming to reposition it to a more active square. Black castles kingside, ensuring the king's safety and bringing the rook into play. White plays the pawn to h3, preventing any potential bishop or knight moves to g4. Black retreats the bishop to a7, keeping it on the long diagonal and avoiding any pawn advances. White moves the bishop back to b3, maintaining pressure on the center and the f7 square. Black develops the bishop to e6, offering an exchange of bishops. White accepts the exchange, capturing the bishop on b3. Black recaptures with the queen, centralizing the queen and preparing to connect the rooks. White moves the queen to b3, keeping the queen active and eyeing the center. Black plays the queen to d7, connecting the rooks and preparing to bring them into the game. White repositions the knight to f1, aiming to bring it to a more active square. Black advances the pawn to h6, preventing any knight moves to g5. White moves the knight to g3, eyeing the f5 and h5 squares. Black brings the rook to b8, preparing to put pressure on the b2 pawn. White develops the bishop to e3, preparing to exchange the dark-squared bishops. Black captures the bishop on e3, and White recaptures with the rook. Black moves the knight to h7, aiming to reposition it to a more active square. White advances the pawn to d4, challenging Black's center and opening lines for the pieces. Black repositions the knight to g5, attacking the bishop on e3. White moves the rook to d1, centralizing the rook and supporting the d4 pawn. Black advances the pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop and solidify the kingside. White moves the knight to h4, eyeing the f5 square and preparing for an attack. Black repositions the knight to a5, attacking the queen on d5. White moves the queen to d5, centralizing the queen and putting pressure on Black's position. Black moves the queen to a4, attacking the pawn on b3. White advances the pawn to b3, defending the pawn and attacking the queen. Black captures the pawn on a2, grabbing material but exposing the queen. White moves the rook to e1, centralizing the rook and preparing for an attack. Black advances the pawn to c6, supporting the queen and opening lines for the pieces. White captures the pawn on d6, grabbing material and opening lines for the attack. Black captures the pawn on b3, maintaining material balance but exposing the queen. White captures the pawn on e5, centralizing the queen and preparing for an attack. Black advances the pawn to b6, defending the knight and preparing to push the pawn. White moves the knight to gf5, eyeing the g7 square and preparing for an attack. Black captures the knight with the pawn, opening lines but exposing the king. White recaptures with the knight, centralizing the knight and preparing for an attack. Black moves the pawn to f6, defending the knight and preparing to push the pawn. White moves the queen to g3, eyeing the g7 square and preparing for an attack. Black moves the king to h8, avoiding any potential checks. White advances the pawn to h4, preparing to open lines for the attack. Black repositions the knight to e6, defending the g7 square and preparing to counterattack. White moves the queen to g6, eyeing the g7 square and preparing for an attack. Black brings the rook to b7, defending the 7th rank and preparing to counterattack. White advances the pawn to d5, opening lines for the attack. Black repositions the knight to g7, defending the g7 square and preparing to counterattack. White captures the pawn on h6 with the queen, delivering a check and opening lines for the attack. Black moves the king to g8, avoiding the check and preparing to counterattack. White moves the rook to d3, centralizing the rook and preparing for an attack. Black captures the knight with the knight, opening lines but exposing the king. White recaptures with the pawn, centralizing the pawn and preparing for an attack. Black brings the rook to g7, defending the 7th rank and preparing to counterattack. White moves the rook to e7, centralizing the rook and preparing for an attack. Black brings the rook to f7, defending the 7th rank and preparing to counterattack. White moves the rook to e8, delivering a check and opening lines for the attack. Black moves the rook to f8, defending the 8th rank and preparing to counterattack. White moves the rook to g3, centralizing the rook and preparing for an attack. And with that, Black resigns, giving the victory to Denis Kadric and Montenegro. What a thrilling game with brilliant moves like bxh6 and qd2 that turned the tide in White's favor. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your comments below. Until next time, keep enjoying the beautiful game of chess.